Scott, there are sign-in cards if you want to give testimony.
I'm sorry?
Little yellow cards for if you want to give testimony. That might save you a little time if you're going to get up there.
We gotta write the whole letter out.
No, just your
sign
name
in.
and address so that makes it easier for
I'll
us.
put it on this.
Oh,
Yeah, but if you want to speak, we need to use the cards. Thank you.
if I'm going to make everybody else do it, you have to do it too.
Twice.
Okay, I'd like to call to order the March 15th meeting of the Planning Commission. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, have the roll call.
Sharon Watts,
Present.
Paul Jensen,
Hi.
Paula Bozell,
Present.
June Jones,
Present.
Connie Taylor.
Okay. All right, the first item is approval of the February 15th minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move we approve the minutes of the February 15th meeting.
Second?
Second?
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the meeting, the minutes for the February 15th meeting. Are there any comments?
Sharon and I went to the parliamentary procedure,
Jurassic Parliament.
Jurassic Parliament workshop, which was fantastic, very helpful. And Gal facilitating that program stressed several times that minutes, generally comments aren't appropriate for minutes, and that minutes should really stick to actions. And that seemed like it would solve a lot of problems for us, but it also made a lot of sense.
And give me, point of question, if the minutes are incorrect, give me an example of how that would
At least
manifest.
speak up.
I asked him to give me an example of something specific in terms of an action, because if the minutes aren't correct, I think this is the time to correct them. So I'm just asking
Yep.
for an explanation.
Yes, the idea was that, like, our comments, what we as commissioners say, what, members of the public speak on the record, that doesn't really belong in the minutes. The minutes is more for actions that this committee
Motions and so forth.
takes. And that seems like it would clean up the minutes a lot, it would simplify our jobs a lot, it would simplify Janice's job substantially. And I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that having any discussions in the minutes really serves any purpose.
Okay, I have a question. I attended a meeting June 29th, and I've asked for, on 3 or 4 occasions, that I be listed as attending that meeting, and in the final minutes for that day, I still don't show that I was in attendance at that meeting. And if I can't deal with that in the minutes, then when would I do it? That's a question.
That's absolutely when you, I think that would be when you would.
No,
do that.
what he's saying is that you don't have to have all of the details of what somebody says. So, you have a discussion on a topic. You just say that there was a discussion. You don't have to have all of the, try to capture everything that was said.
So for an example from this last month's minutes, during the discussion workshop, it says, the first paragraph, Mr. Garrison presented information along with Steve Canfield and Mike Hartford on potential, and so on. Doesn't need to be there.
I don't know why this is part of it. I mean, I'm not saying I don't disagree with you. I'm just like, we're just talking about the minutes from last month. That's the motion on the floor.
Exactly, yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm talking about those minutes as well as all of our other minutes,
Okay,
going forward.
going forward. I think it's appropriate to list when somebody testifies in front of us what their comments are. I don't think we generally have had comments from the commissioners in the minutes.
Well, apparently even what people who, come up and testify, you don't have to detail everything they said. We do have the recordings of them if people want to know exactly what was said.
Yeah, I think, my feeling on it is that, trying to provide a concise summary of what somebody says in a format that's going to fit in the minutes, that's not going to be effective. We're not really going to be able to get anybody's actual ideas across. So I don't see any reason to even try. It doesn't seem like it adds anything. Doesn't really serve any purpose. I think confining the minutes to just actions that were taken by the commission makes the most sense to me.
Well, I'm with Connie. Have you got an example from this month's meeting of what you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, so public comment, first thing.
Well, that's public comment. That's not an action item.
I know.
So therefore, it doesn't need,
Yeah,
he's saying
so
it
there's-
doesn't need to be on.
So public comment.
Oh.
Public comment was accepted. That is the action that was taken. I think really anything along that it's trying to summarize what a person said isn't really appropriate for the minutes.
So tell me how a citizen can tell what's going on and what has gone on if all it says is...
Because there's the tapes to look at, the video and the audio.
Personally, I couldn't tell with any good idea, what went on, even with a summary of what somebody said. Like, that doesn't really do much for me. So I think it's silly to try, and it really complicates a lot of our job and a lot of Janice's job without, as far as I can tell, much benefit.
So that would require all the citizens and the planning commissioners to... The tapes become vital to this. How long are they available? And we've already had problems where the machine's been turned off, and that really concerns me. We are a public body.
Yeah, there's not much we can do about the issues if there's a technical error. So what's important about the minutes, though, is that we can recreate, okay, the last 2 minutes of tape are missing, but we know, because we've recorded who made the motion, what the motion was, and how the vote went. How many times you went back and forth in discussing the particulars of that motion or the pros and cons of that motion aren't necessarily as important for the minutes, which is what the tape theoretically should function for. And if the tape is missing, or the tape doesn't or has technical problems, the motion has still been recorded, and so there's still the official record of the motion and what was passed and who voted for it.
So, I agree with you. If I look back in the old minutes, there's a lot of comments between the commissioners, there's a lot of discussion. But our more recent minutes, that hasn't been the case. Janice and Travis have cleaned them up. But if you're suggesting, and I'm not clear, that when Scott gets up and says, I'm here to speak against something, that shouldn't be registered in the minute as public comment, that Scott Perry of blah, blah, blah address got up and spoke in opposition to dogs running in the street.
I think we could, list the names of people who spoke. I don't think the content.
I think you could state that he spoke against. I think the question is whether you want to try and
No, I
have a
don't think we
whole
should.
lot of, recording of what he said,
Right.
writing
Yeah,
down what he said.
I agree with that, but I think citizen comment is different than action items.
And how we would handle this with this new method that we've kind of been following is, so if you look at page 4 of the packet, the workshop discussions, number 1. So that's just a general statement. At 21:30, there was a general discussion by these 3 guys, and then you went back and forth. We didn't really capture that. Now, if Scott had got up and said something, we would have stepped in and said, at 49:49 of the tape, Scott, a neighbor of the property, stood up and had general comments about this, and then there's back and forth. So that way, at least Scott could figure out on the tape where he was, or if you had questions about what Scott particularly said, you could find that exact moment. You wouldn't have to listen, because there's like a 40-minute gap between that and the next time. So that was just generally you and the citizens who wanted the question answered back and forth. So there was a lot of ground covered, and trying to, put that in minutes is pretty daunting. Whereas if a neighbor stands up and kind of starts, if this was a public hearing, then Sharon would say, okay, we're now opening it up to the public, and we would record that time, and everybody who's pro would be in the first section, and whoever's con would be in the next section. So we would capture those in quick bites, but we wouldn't necessarily say, yes, you discussed the subdivision and voted 6 to 1, or 5 to 1, 5 to nothing to approve it. So if it was a land use case, there would be more in here because it is relevant. But for a general discussion about work items, or like this discussion, I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time recording this, other than it was a discussion about the pros and cons and whatever you decide to do.
Right, and I would
So
say.
they would look like this, excuse me? They would look similar, okay, I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah, and I would, and the reason I mention this is just because it came up in this training several times. Said that, we're trying to record anything about what people actually say.
Actually,
Just isn't a good idea.
before these minutes were prepared, Sharon and I had a discussion about them.
Oh, fantastic.
And she gave me the materials from the session she was at. So
Yeah.
those are based on what she gave me and discussion with Travis about how they should be done.
Yeah, fantastic.
So they're a lot briefer than they would have been.
Which I imagine is I would hope would make things a little easier on you going forward as well. So.
Well, since my public comments aren't correct in the minutes, I'm just going to make them again this month, so.
All right, the section where you made a public comment. Okay, well, can we correct them right now?
You can, if you want the minutes correct, but I'm going to restate them anyway.
Okay.
So, and I guess, I would say that trying to get your comment in the minutes, I guess that's, not you in particular, Jones, but just trying to get anybody's comment, like trying to capture someone's comment in the minutes does not seem worthwhile. And it seems kind of counterproductive.
So you
Because-
just want to do away with public comment?
No, not at all, of course not.
Then why wouldn't we so-and-so got up and said,
Because
I'm
having it-
concerned about dogs.
Because having it in the minutes does not change the fact of their comment. Does not change the fact of their comment being in public record. It does not, all it does is create an opportunity for miscommunication and conflict. I don't think it serves any purpose.
All right, since we're still in discussion, it concerns me that if I were just reading this, June Jones concerns that the appearance of bias and procedural oddities jeopardize the decision-making process in 2 rezoning cases heard by the Planning Commission. I take my job very serious here, and I go back. I don't want to have to run to a tape every time. I want an accurate representation of what was said.
And I don't believe that's possible.
But if you're doing an accurate interpretation, then does that mean you have to write down verbatim, or she has to transcribe verbatim what was said?
And that is not the purpose of the minutes, in my understanding.
Well, at least they should be correct.
Sure, right, like if they're going to be in there, they should be correct, which is, and I don't think we can ever get them correct to everyone's satisfaction. So I think it would be much simpler to simply leave them out.
Like, for example, if you're talking about, it says 2 rezoning cases, if that's actually supposed to be the rezone and the comprehensive plan case, 2 cases,
Well,
but not both
there weren't
rezone- Oh,
two zone re-app, there weren't,
Yeah, so that's the kind of correction, yeah.
but that's not what I
clearly should be
said,
making.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think Scott came in after the December meeting and said, I think that, I agree with you, it's hard to get an actual representation of what somebody said.
Well, it seems to me, June, if you think that there's, incorrect...
I don't
Here.
think, Sharon, I
Well,
don't.
well, then it should be done now. Because if we approve the minutes, then it's saying that there is no problem with what's written here.
Well, I have a problem with what was said there. I just hadn't brought it up here appropriately, other than in response to Tel's comments, that, yes, it's very difficult to get a representation of what someone was talking about.
Right.
I agree. Using this as an example, my comments were not correctly represented. So I agree with what he said.
But it seems like the time to correct that is now when we're talking about the minutes.
Okay. Can I read a little segment of this? This is Mastering Council Meetings, a guidebook for elected officials and local governments. This is under the heading of minutes. And, this isn't law, but it seems useful. The purpose of minutes is to preserve an accurate record of a council's actions. Council minutes are not intended to inform absent members of all that went on at the meeting they missed, to create a record of the reasons for a council's decision, nor to demonstrate the eloquence and brilliance of elected officials to their public. Council should use action minutes in which actions are noted briefly and simply. Minutes of this type will include the following items: place of meeting, time the meeting started and ended, which members of the council were present and, if relevant, any absences, the fact that a quorum was present, text of all main motions taken up by the council and their disposition, if amendments were made, the final version of the motion as amended, any points of order that were made and the resolution, and if the council went into executive session, the time of entering and the time of leaving such session. And that's all. And it goes on to say that if public comment is made, it is ordinarily sufficient to note the fact. Some councils include the names and addresses of those who spoke, and some go even further, summarizing the remarks that members of the public make. At a public hearing, which is a different type of meeting, including the content of remarks is appropriate. I think the reason for that is to avoid these conflicts that are inevitably going to arise when somebody feels like their remarks were not accurately portrayed. And I think that is, through no fault of anyone's really, that's almost guaranteed to happen. and I just don't think fighting that battle every month is serving any purpose. So I think, summarizing people's comments during a public hearing, that makes perfect sense. Otherwise, I don't think it does.
And June, if there are issues that you think need to be corrected, you could send those to us and we could make them part of the packet before it comes to the Planning Commission. So that way, the Planning Commission would have that week of advance notice to identify what you thought was a corrected action, just like any other citizen. So if Scott felt his was wrong, he could send us something. And the meeting before last, the first meeting I was here, he turned in his things in writing, and we simplified his verbal comments, but yeah, his written ones were included.
Well, Scott's not coachable.
So, June, you want to tell us what the corrections would be for?
Yeah, I specifically said that my comments were about Sharon and Paula, that they were the two commissioners that failed to to disclose their ex parte communication, and that they were the two commissioners that were challenged for bias and did not recuse themselves at the hearing. So, I mean, I know that the Vancouver City Council, or the Vancouver Planning Commission includes citizens' comments. I just looked up the Battleground Planning Commission. They include a record of the citizen comments. Kalama does, Longview, Kelso. It's the norm in our community for citizens' comments to be noted.
Okay, when you say record, does that mean that they, try and...
Sam Crumpet welcomed and introduced Commissioner Hickman to the Planning Commission. It's noted in there. I mean, typically, when a citizen gets up and comments in the other jurisdictions in our region, they're noted in the minutes.
Well, okay, noted is different than trying to reproduce what they said.
I don't understand, Tel. Are you saying what you said was, we took comments, period, end of...
No, I think you would, it's fine to list who talked, who gave comments, and...
what the purpose of their comments are?
Yeah, but we don't have to go into the whole
Yeah, and
thing that they say.
Personally, for me, unless it's a public hearing, I think a name and address are more than enough. I don't think that the content of the comment is appropriate or useful in the minutes.
So
That's my opinion.
Okay, so use Scott Perry as an example. What would you change that to read? What would you have it read?
I would have it read, let's see, we could have a list of, citizen comments were received from Scott Perry, address, June Jones, address.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Is it really appropriate to publish the address?
I don't know.
No, I think
that's in the
I think
record.
that's optional.
Yeah, I don't have any problem leaving that out. That doesn't seem important. I'm really ambivalent about whether even to put a name in. If we want to put names in, that's fine. If not, that seems fine too.
Boy, this doesn't seem transparent to me, and particularly when the citizens are speaking, I can really buy into what you're saying about these other things, but I think public comment is really important.
See, but then it becomes an issue of how much do you include, how much do you include if you leave something out that somebody thinks is important. It becomes a judgment on Janice's part.
I agree. I agree with you that public comment is incredibly important. I believe that transparency is incredibly important, and that's part of the reason that I feel this way. Because there's despite everybody's best intentions, we're never going to capture what somebody says. And I don't believe that the minutes are an effective or appropriate way to, make that public. I just don't think that's the right way to do it. But you're not wrong about the importance of public comment, obviously. That is, of paramount importance, and so is transparency. Those are...
So you think they're important, but they're not important enough to put in the minutes?
Well,
I mean,
But they're-
you're such a contrast to what you're saying.
But they're available.
there's a question about specificity, though, because we could add a statement that June's comment included specifically Paula and Sharon by name, that they were biased and didn't recuse themselves.
Actually, it was about ex parte. We received information from the city attorney about declaring ex parte communications. That's what it was, that was my understanding
Okay,
what it
so,
was.
Well,
so the particular content of that is not germane.
Is that factual versus what she commented on? So I don't know the nuances of that. But say, for example, talking about Scott. Scott had some information about a particular piece of property and the price it was. Should I have put the parcel number, the address, the location, the zoning, and put in Scott's sales pitch because he mentioned it?
You're
So
saying
would
it's
it be
all or nothing.
So would it be inappropriate for me to specifically talk about the particular property that he was talking about? Or did we capture his spirit when we said, hey, industrial providers, this is awfully big ask that we're asking them to build the entire road, which is what this says. But in that case, it might be okay to summarize Scott's, but it might not be okay to summarize for me and Janice to decide what Paula wants, what June wants in the minutes versus what Scott's okay with being in the minutes. That's kind of where, if you think there should be more detail, you should send that to us ahead of time. We'll put it in here, and then you guys can vote to adopt or strike out as you see fit. Because you really have two options right now. You can adopt it the way it is, or June can make a motion to include some language, and then you could take action on that, whether it's amended or goes ahead the way it is.
So I don't regularly attend city council meetings, but the public comments in city council meetings, you get these things like, Bev Jones went down and talked about children running in the street in front of her house, and it doesn't necessarily what street it is, but that there's a comment. It's kind of like the police chief reports and says, we've been having a lot of crime in such and such a neighborhood. So you read it to get information. I don't listen to the tape. I'm not going to listen to the tapes, Some people are, and
I don't think that many people are going to listen to the
Yeah,
tape.
but you're sort of comparing a report to minutes.
no, those are public comments in the city council
And-
minutes.
Yeah, well, the minutes should be, I've always thought, and I'm the secretary now, that the importance of the minutes is what action the group took. And this is what the essence of minutes are.
Yes, that's
I can
entirely what I'm going after. That's what I'm driving toward.
And I can accept that for our actions, but I think public comments from citizens, I think that is a different level of,
They need to be more specific.
I think they
And
need...
that's just a procedural issue. If that's how you want us to do, like the public comment section, or public comment, and when we're in a land use hearing, if it's a member of the public's comments, we can just add additional detail in that, whereas this conversation, we can just gloss over as a general discussion of what's applicable. Once you decide what you want to do, we'll start carrying that out.
Okay, Mr. Perry, you put down here that you wanted to talk about minutes, and, we have a box of item on the agenda or item not on the agenda, but the minutes are on the agenda, I guess, so did you want to?
Well, I'm glad Tel and I are on the same page for a change. Scott Perry, 180 South Pekin. I did come tonight to speak just briefly about the minutes, And quite frankly, it came to be constructive. I told you once before, I think this is one of the most important committees that we have. And, we've got some new people doing things and so forth. And so, I think it's just a great idea to get off on the right foot. With the tapes of the meetings, it makes it a lot easier to go back and review something and say, okay, I wanted to be sure I heard that right, and that sort of thing. So I think that is a terrific step forward. But I've had experiences where the technology disappears for many, many different reasons. We had an example not too long ago where the meeting was short. But I've had other situations. I think that it's important that the minutes are detailed enough to at least show what did go on, because many of the people, I've talked to a number of them that have no idea how to go onto the web and listen to the minutes. On the other hand, they're published. We should be able to pick them up and read them and get a pretty good idea of what's going on. I think that the minutes currently do omit important details, and have noticed where sometimes there are corrections to the minutes before you approve them, but I never see where those corrections have been recorded. And I have a couple of examples. Brian Ripp's testimony on June 15th, most addresses, and mine was 180 South Pekin if I didn't give it, most addresses were recorded as to, who spoke and their address. In that case, his wasn't, and somebody requested on July 20th that be, his address be added as part of the approval of those minutes. Where would I find that correction? December 21st, Jim Stock address omitted. More importantly, November 30th minutes were approved with the understanding, quote, additional corrections to be provided via email by Connie Taylor for action item 1. It goes on just a little bit, but that gets the point. Where would I find those corrections?
May I address? Okay, I actually supplied those to Janice, and she did incorporate them, and they are in the final minutes that I was able to look at today.
And final minutes should be produced so that Sharon can sign them, and their signature blocks at the bottom.
Right.
And then those are the ones that become the final record.
Those are in process. I also discovered yesterday or today that there's a place to publish those minutes in where we create the agendas, and I need to find out exactly how to go about doing that.
So they will be available online, you're saying?
I believe so. I believe so.
I have gone looking for
You
minutes myself.
believe they are or they will be?
I believe that there's a way to do that. I don't know how to do it yet.
Okay, thank you. Because I had looked to try to find this, and that's why. I was aware that you had provided them, or I believed you had, but I could not find it.
Travis, did you have something?
Sorry.
Okay, or you want to let him? Okay, go ahead.
Tonight, for January 15th, for the minutes of February 15th, don't reflect my comments were direct to small industries. I didn't want the whole thing, provided, but I thought it was kind of important that it be understood that I didn't mean all industrial should not have sidewalks and so forth. But that happened to be a small 2-acre parcel. And it's kind of minor, but on the other hand, it's kind of important as well. But more important, I did understand what Citizen Jones commented on the importance of commissioners being disclosed ex yeah, that, apartheid comments, in the two may not have, which could have been an issue providing the zoning application a legal remedy. In other words, because that did become an issue, or very possibly could have been, had that gotten more complicated on that particular issue. Again, I came to be constructive and anyway, I came to be constructive. I realize we're all kind of doing some new things, but I think it's very important, especially the public comment, not necessarily mine always, but some of the others, at least the basic information is provided, and I think it would be maybe a plus if most of them would turn around and maybe give their comments to staff so that they can decide, okay, I could use this, but I don't want to use that.
So what you're saying about your testimony here about, it should have been small industrial property, I mean, that's exactly an example of how Janice trying to summarize it, may or may not get it right, and...
Yeah, no, and I agree with Travis that I didn't intend that it should be, that
Right.
particular parcel, et cetera, et cetera. But I was trying to get across to the point that planning is in a position that, we want to try to get the industrial area growing and so forth, and being a little more flexible in that area is something that you should be taking up as an action item.
Right, so, but as I was saying, this is an example of, how does she record what you say? How much of it does she say? I mean, you're saying that it was important to say small industrial properties, right? You mentioned that it should have been small.
Yeah, but I mean, that isn't the whole point of my discussion, but I used it as an example. I quite frankly, I'm not sure in that meeting was necessarily the best one, but I know a lot of the meetings where we have a lot of testimony, I think it's important that the public testimony is reflected well in the minutes.
Well, there's the there's the problem that reflecting it well is, subjective in some ways.
I'm not up there to make these decisions. You are, thank you.
Right, so I think that, thank you, Mr. Berry. I think that really illustrates my point exactly. The only way we can accurately portray what public comments actually say is verbatim, to copy them down verbatim, and that's just not reasonable. And the other way to get them accurately is for someone to listen to the recording. I don't see how trying to summarize someone's comments in the minutes is ever going to work.
Other than the word small, I think Mr. Perry's comments were summarized fairly well. I think June Jones' comments were not accurately expressed, and it raises concerns about transparency to me when a citizen mentions a commissioner and then that commissioner eliminates their name from this public comment. I mean, that raises concerns about transparency for me.
Well, I mean, we didn't erase our names from this.
Well, I don't even know what a procedural oddity is. What is, somebody tell me what a procedural oddity is.
This is where it gets subjective. It's Janice's summarizing of this, or I assume Yeah, but it gets subjective.
And I did listen to the tape repeatedly, trying to capture the essence of what was said, but it's, as you point out, everyone has a different perspective on how that sounds.
Right, and that's very difficult, and I don't believe that is a responsible use of staff time. I certainly don't disagree with you about transparency being important, but I think if anything, trying to summarize public comment makes things more opaque rather than more transparent.
It could,
I think this
yeah.
is going to create an environment why people are going to say, why bother, my comments
Yeah,
aren't
me too.
recorded.
Me too.
Aren't.
Well,
So there's a letter, and I don't even know why I have a copy of it. It's May 18th, 2017, from Will Finn to the Planning Commission. And he says, "Please be prepared to see a new agenda coming forward. I was displeased with the format. I'm going to make all the formats the same." Is this a change from what Will directed in May?
no. We didn't used to have these public comment sections. He directed that those be added.
I'm not proposing to change our agenda. Not at all. I'm proposing to change the way our minutes are
This
recorded.
agenda is based on what he wanted, what the mayor wanted.
And that's an interesting example, because, for example, if somebody like the mining guys wanted to come forth and talk about something that's not on the agenda, and they wanted to get your opinion and have you guys debate it so that they could help you
Workshop it.
workshop it, theoretically, that's what this item is on the agenda for. However, I would have to tell you that they have to apply for a planning commission interpretation. It has to be publicly noticed. It costs them money, and staff does time to prepare a staff report, and then it comes before you and you have that discussion. Theoretically, I don't necessarily agree with this being on your agenda, because if they want it on your agenda to talk to you, they have to apply and pay just like everybody else.
Well, you
So-
put them on the agenda.
Because they came in and talked to me, yes. And at
Yeah.
the time, I didn't realize that they actually should have applied for an application, and the next one that requires planning commission discussion will apply for a similar use determination, and they will pay just like, who was it? The port came in about the administrative office building just like 6 months ago. So that's how it should have happened. But having this on the agenda applies that anybody who disagrees with me can come talk to you and get your services and your opinions for free, even though they should apply for it. So, but if the mayor wants it on the agenda so that, people can talk about things that aren't on the agenda, that's fine. That's an example of a case where it should have been on the agenda because it should have had a permit number, and it should be a open record discussion, because let's say that those mining guys come in and apply for a similar use determination, you all technically have to disclose your ex parte communication because you've all talked to them. You've all talked
But
to them
not during
in
the
a
course of
quorum.
an application.
Not during the course of an application, but that's a debatable discussion, because we determined that they may not need an application depending on where they apply. And is somebody going to argue that the 5 of you are all tainted now because you've had an in-depth discussion with them outside of the application process as a quorum? So,
All right, I have one last question. Do our minutes mirror the city council minutes? I mean, are their minutes going to look exactly like this? Because I've looked at city council minutes recently, and they talk about public comment, and they list who said and what it's about. So
yes.
I think that if they do this, and this is their, they should, Will was very specific when he addressed this
Yeah.
commission, that he wants it to be like the city council.
Yeah, I mean, his letter, if you don't have a copy, and I don't know why it does, it's like, moving forward, I will be monitoring the commission for transparency and unbiased decision-making. And he's like, I'm going to set your,
Does he say anything about the minutes in that?
would you, like me to give you a copy and you can
No.
read it?
Will also asked us to go to this parliamentary training a couple weeks ago. So,
He's just coming back with what this expert said at the parliamentary training.
Now, if I could, I want to go back to something that Scott said that raises an example of why this is a difficult question. Because he had mentioned somebody in the minutes wanted to go back and add their address to the minutes. That's very important because to be a party of record on a land use application, you have to give your name, your address, and specifically address issues that are addressed by the code. That gives you legal standing to appeal that application. Now, if that person gave testimony and didn't give us their name, they do not have standing to appeal that case.
What about if they didn't give their
However,
address?
if we went back a month later or 2 months later and added their address so that it appears that they are a party of record, that may cause a problem because if staff doesn't realize that, yes, it's in the it's in the minutes, therefore he has standing, if Amanda had allowed that to happen, I may not know any better, and I give them standing to appeal. The applicant who gets appealed would be able to sue the city because this guy had no standing, and we allowed him to interfere with his due process rights because I was based upon the minutes, which imply that his address is part of the record. And so the more detail you put in the minutes, it implies that at the meeting he said his address. And he may not have, which means he has no standing, which has legal ramifications.
Well, I think that's the meeting that you're not listed as attending, correct, Connie?
Yes, and I'm the one that brought up, he did not give his address. I contend, and I put it in writing, that he didn't have standing because he didn't give his address. And so then, this went on for months, and finally, I called the city, and they said, well, his mother had gone into the record and added an address, but it was an incorrect address. It wasn't his address at the time he testified. So tell me.
I think we're losing track of the fact that we're talking about minutes, and the reason why they call it minutes, at least in my mind, is it's an encapsulation of what went on without minute detail.
Yeah, so I think, there's a motion on the table about approving the current meeting, so I don't think I can make another motion
You
about
can.
how we do the minutes going forward. So I won't, but
Was there a second to that motion?
Yes, there was a motion to approve the February minutes, and there was a second. And we're in the discussion phase.
so we're discussing that. But I think it's something we should definitely consider. I guess, I would, if I had my druthers, I would amend February's minutes to reflect an action minutes format.
What does that mean? Just to go through.
Yeah, so that's what we've been talking about, where,
So are you amending the motion on
no,
the
no,
floor?
I'm still just discussing. Just when I do amend,
Well,
Try to be
I'm going to just call the
unambiguous about it.
question.
Okay. So, but I still need to know what you're doing, what to do about correcting your section. This does seem like...
I said what my correction was. I said,
Okay.
So we could put that in the minutes for the next meeting.
fine.
We can amend this.
Well, you need to decide your motion as it was stated. And if it gets defeated, then we could add it to the February correction.
Which is
and then we
fine.
vote again.
Okay.
If not, we will just add it to the March meetings that there was additional content that wasn't correct.
But the motion doesn't state that move as amended.
It doesn't, yes. So you need to decide based upon the motion.
I'm going to vote to approve. Move on.
Okay, nobody is proposing an amendment to this motion, to these minutes, rather. Okay. So we have a motion to approve the February minutes. All in favor?
Aye.
Is she going to poll us?
I don't know that you necessarily have to. Do you want to poll us, or
Yeah,
do you want to poll us? Okay.
Oh, okay.
let's poll.
You get to vote here.
Is that how?
That's not what I'm supposed to do. I was trying to go back in and fix, because the names are wrong. I was going to fix those and move on, and I got stuck in that motion.
Oh,
And I can't.
so that's the council.
That's the city council. I keep having to change the names.
Well, we can just do nothing for the correct thing.
Okay. That's fine.
Okay, so Connie Taylor,
Nay.
Tel Jensen,
Nah.
Sharon Watt,
Yes?
Jean Jones.
Day. Yes.
Paula Bosa.
Okay, so the minutes are not approved.
Okay, Tel, if I move to approve the minutes with corrections, I move to approve the minutes with corrections.
I second.
Okay, so
So
state
now
the
you're
corrections.
debating the corrections, right?
We're not
She asked me to state them, I will
State the
state that the
corrections.
only correction I have is the June Jones comments at the February 15 minutes is that my comments were lack of disclosure of ex parte communication by Commissioner Watt, Commissioner Bosell, and their failure to recuse themselves when they were declared to have bias.
Okay. So I have those notes very similar to that, and we'll get those.
I can put it back this way.
Okay.
There's a motion on the floor.
Yeah, but we didn't get a second to the motion.
I did.
Or did we say, okay. right,
I was
sorry.
thinking the same thing.
Okay, any discussion? All right, so let's go ahead and vote on it.
Roll call. So Connie Taylor,
Yeah.
Yes.
Tel Jensen,
Nay.
Sharon Watt,
Yay.
Jean Jones,
Yes.
Paula Bosel.
Yes.
The motion passes.
Okay, so can we move on now to the approval of this agenda for March 15th?
I move to approve the agenda as
Presented, yes.
it stands, as it is, the way it is.
Do we have a second?
I second.
Okay,
The worst motion ever.
all right, any discussion? Okay, do we want to do a roll call on this one too?
I don't think.
Okay. All in favor of approving the agenda, say aye, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So, apparently we don't have any other public comment because yours was about minutes, Mr. Perry, and we've done that. Okay. So, all right, so we are now on the rules of procedure for the Planning Commission. So I guess we'll go straight to page I don't know, the page with all the red on it then. I'm having trouble reading the numbers at the bottom.
Yeah.
I think it's page
It's
9.
because the system doesn't, only does the proposals. There's no way to look at that.
Okay. Can I ask, let's see, like the third paragraph of red,
Starts with the commission?
with the commission, yes. Why is the word "and" capitalized?
For emphasis.
I mean, yeah, for emphasis, I guess, but is there a particular
Yeah,
reason?
no, probably. Sorry, that was probably me.
Okay. In the next paragraph, 1, 2, 3, fourth line down, it says council member. Is that supposed to be commissioner?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Can I ask I just have a question.
Okay,
So,
let me.
okay,
There's
sorry.
another thing in that paragraph. And then at the end of the next line, it's about a ruling by the mayor. I mean, the mayor isn't usually here.
Oh, by the mayor or chair. Yeah, sorry, this was a generic language.
Yes, I thought so, yeah. Okay, so, June, you want to say something?
well, I think in January Connie wasn't here, and we kind of hashed these around, and Travis made the comment of not everyone was here, so we couldn't approve them. And I got the impression from what you said that this requires a unanimous decision?
No,
No.
a majority, but all 5 of you have to be here to discuss it and agree upon it. And that's in here,
Is it in the old ones?
it is in the old one.
Well, I don't- You know, it just seemed to me fair that everybody be here when we discuss them.
That was my
Yeah.
question.
It's under 7. They have to be amended at any regular or special meeting of the planning commission by a majority vote of the entire membership.
Yeah, so it's entire.
So that was just a courtesy to Connie in January?
Well, it's technically, it's one of your rules that you have to follow.
It's
so-
because it does say entire membership, so.
By a majority vote of the entire membership. Okay, not a quorum.
Yes.
Are we open for discussion?
Sure. Anything else?
Okay, I'm concerned where you actually got this language, because I went into 42.23.070, I pulled up ex parte communications, 480-07310, and these look, I've never seen this language before, and it's not strictly out of the statutes. And I had suggested a couple different sources. So also, just so you know, on the last, under ex parte, there's third line down, proposal which it should be takes place instead of,
Got that one.
but,
And spell check.
but where did this language come from, and how come it was selected over Washington State Legislative Code information? Because I will tell you, when I did my research today, there's nothing that says that, where it says a council member, but it should be a commissioner who refuses to step down after a challenge and the advice of the city attorney. I found no statutory language that ever mentioned a city attorney.
So I took various parts of this from various different jurisdictions, and I looked for new adopted language that was less than 3 years old. And so I wanted something that had recently been approved by another jurisdiction
In Washington?
in Washington State, yes. And it was from documents that were available. That part in particular, I think, reflects some of the conversation that I had heard at the last meeting. It's not necessarily consistent with RCW, because I don't think the RCW says no member of the decision body shall participate in ex parte communication. As a matter of fact, the RCW specifically says if you do participate, you have to declare it.
And it all, yeah, and it
Yes.
says, so the language here,
So it is a tougher standard than what the RCW implies.
yes, but it says here, an ex parte communication is a one-sided discussion between a decision maker and a proponent or opponent. I mean, here is the Washington State Legislative information, and it's far more than that. I mean, you need to, it's not just a one-sided. If you've had, I mean, there are criteria which you have, that you meet, and then you have to declare all this stuff. So you're confident that this is the latest and most precise way for rules?
No. I'm confident that this reflected the conversation that I heard at the last meeting. Because theoretically, these are your rules. You could go back to what was originally proposed, and that is, we shall follow the RCW, and that's it. We don't need to add any more. But part of the problem from the last discussion was, there was one paragraph, and it covered 3 topics, and nobody was happy that they were covered very well. And so there was a desire to split that out so that you could specifically say conflict of interest, appearance of fairness, ex parte communication. They all warrant discussion individually as opposed to one sentence covers them all.
Well, and I brought that up,
Yeah.
and I think it's really important. I wanted those, because the definition of conflict of interest, that has a specific definition. And so,
It has a specific definition regardless of whether or not we include that definition in our rules, right? Like, we can't contravene the RCW. We can't change the definition of appearance of fairness or conflict of interest. That's not, and, there again, there's, if we're not redefining these things, that definition exists elsewhere.
so since I brought it up, I will do a mea culpa type thing, but, I mean, I think they should be broken out, and maybe, and I'm interested in what the commission says, but maybe you just cite the RCWs for each section.
And if you look at the first paragraph, the conflict of interest, that's the case where I did kind of the statement of what I thought you wanted reflected, and you're responsible to comply with the RCW. Whether it says so in the soft and fuzzy sentence ahead, you're still responsible to meet that RCW. So that's an example of where I felt there was your rules, then there's the law, and they're both in here.
Well, this didn't accomplish what I was trying to set out, and this
Okay.
is not your fault.
Okay.
But I guess I take your point as well taken, Tel, and I would like some discussion on this, but maybe on each of these, you just cite the RCW and leave all this other stuff out. I would be interested.
That would be very simple.
I would like that.
And I apologize for the time you took.
Isn't ex parte communication covered in the appearance of fairness statute?
It has its own number.
It has its own? Okay. So we just have 3 paragraphs?
Yeah.
And cite the code.
And I sort of feel like,
Like that.
the planning commission is governed by some other RCWs as well. I don't know. Part of me thinks just throwing RCWs in there, we're bound to whether we mention them or not, is particularly useful.
Well, I noticed in some of this, they were talking about elected officers, and that's one question. Specifically, I think it was 42.23.070, but it talked about what officers and elected officials. And we are a volunteer commission, and we are not officers.
Yes, so there is a difference between the two. And some of this language doesn't apply to appointed elected officials, or appointed officials, whereas some of it does apply to elected officials.
Correct, and I think we got to be careful there. So, I guess we're all in agreement that we just go back to citing the applicable RCW?
So that last paragraph, or that last sentence in conflict of interest says, commission members are expected to comply with RCW in the conduct of their duties. Would you like that conflict of interest, that statement with the RCW, appearance of fairness, that statement with the RCW, and ex parte communication, that statement with the RCW citation. So I can compact this into 3 quick paragraphs that include one sentence, and it's the same sentence with different numbers in each one.
I'd go for that.
I would go for that.
Stylistically, I don't like it, but that doesn't seem of primary importance here.
So you're saying you'd strike most of this?
Yes. So all of the red that I added, plus the black in this section that I haven't struck out yet, and it'll just be 3 simple sentences. I think that would make it a relatively simple motion for you to do it that way.
Can we, since you're going to do that, can we make the motion?
So then are we going to just approve them and assume that that's what's going to happen, or do we come back with this next month?
I move that following Travis's suggestion, he will make the changes so that it's stipulating the RCW. So specifically, it would be conflict of interest. Commission members are expected to comply with RCW. Appearance of fairness, it would be the same sentence with the appurtenant RCW, and the ex parte communication would be worded the same way and quote the same RCW, and that we approve these procedures for the Planning Commission.
Yeah, so if you look at the very last page, which has all these places for us to sign, there's a place where it says dated this day of, so I want to be able to know what date to put in that.
So that motion would be today.
So we are going to approve these procedures with the correction that we've talked about to simplify conflict of interest, appearance of fairness, and ex parte communication.
With one correction, I want you to check this, the 4223, to make sure it's the appropriate reference.
I will check the
Thank you.
RCWs for all 3 of them, and I
Thank
will
you.
get approval by the city attorney that they are the applicable.
Thank you, because you understand why.
Yes.
Is that a second?
So that's
I
a,
second.
so that's a friendly
I was
amendment
gonna say-
to
Paula was
the
gonna
first.
say-
I was
Okay,
going to
go ahead.
Okay.
Just to make you
Who
happy.
seconded it?
Just-
I'm sorry. You did.
All right. So are we clear what we're voting on?
Yes.
Okay. Do we want a roll call, or we can just say? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay.
Okay, 5-0. Thank you very much.
So the next, now we're into the 2018 work plan and schedule. Travis?
Yes. So I will pull that up just so you can, but there's paper copies on your thing. So what I did here is I figured what would be an approximate schedule for how quickly I could start working on stuff and bringing it before you. And so I already have a change because of a request made at the managers meeting just yesterday. We are working on, the mayor and Pete would ask me to expedite the wireless communication facilities discussion. So I will work on language on that, and I will have it for you at the next planning commission meeting. I have several contacts in the cellular communication facility field, and so I will ask them to come to the next planning commission meeting next month and try and get them to weigh in on some language that is in there. And so that was something we wanted to kind of expedite and get done first. And since there's not a lot of meet on my list of kind of continuing rolling conditions. I felt that was something that I could do quickly, and of the 3 items that you wanted to work on, that's probably the one that I could move forward with most quickly. So we'll have language for you in a couple weeks, and it's probably going to be 2 or 3, similar to what I'm doing tonight, 2 or 3 examples of how other jurisdictions are doing it, and we'll figure out how to simplify that and make it work for Woodland, and that'll be the discussion next week, or next month. So, the other thing I had, and that is the June 21st meeting. Unfortunately, staff will not be in town for that particular meeting, so we were hoping for a reschedule, or if you wanted to take a month off this summer, that has staff conflicts on the June 21st date. So, people feeling one way or the other? Or do any of those other dates have conflicts that we need to talk about?
September 20th, I'll be out of the country, but I don't know if you want to, because I don't want to miss, I already missed one meeting due to surgery. I don't want to be put in a position where I don't make all my meetings, but.
So, no, I'm not.
You laughing at me?
No, I'm not. Everything that's on this.
So you don't necessarily need to decide that right now, but if you maybe want to come back to the next meeting and have a chance to think about that, check your calendars, find out when.
Right, we could schedule it for another Thursday, or
Yes, or
the
Wednesday,
choice is to
Tuesday.
cancel it, or,
Yeah.
reschedule it.
Understand that whole week, unavailable that whole week?
Yes, I think we overlap, and so one or both of us will be gone one day that week.
Is it out of the question to do a workshop on a Saturday where we have to workshop during the week?
No, I don't think so. I will have to check the union contract and figure out exactly what I need to do, so I have to just make sure that I give proper notification to Janice so that she can adjust her work schedule accordingly.
Or my suggestion would be, with a number of things here that need to move forward, and certainly that the mayor wants us to move, and council wants us to move forward with it would seem like we would add a meeting
Yes.
every other month or every month until we get some of these code languages things, because you're getting into public hearings at the end of the year.
Yes.
We just won't get it done.
Yeah. And as a staff member, I'm a big fan of being able to, if you're willing to commit, 4, 6, 8 hours on a Saturday, I could probably get more public involvement, more interesting exercises and discussions, out of the box, small exercises, small group exercises to help, your creative juices and make it more interesting for you, if we can do, a Saturday. So I have no problem with that. And so if that's what you choose to do, we can do that.
Depends which Saturday. I do have some.
Yeah, exactly.
I do have some conflicts with Saturdays.
And we are, and that's a really good point, because I have a feeling that we are going to get 4 to 6 comprehensive plan amendment requests this year to expand the urban growth boundary and to make comp plan changes this year. So that might be a great opportunity for us to get together and do a ton of work in a single session, rather than spreading that out over, 3 hours a night, 3 months in a row, and having to retread ground that we've already covered.
So the city council voted not to open the comprehensive plan this year,
Yes.
and the comprehensive plan doesn't allow for annexation.
Well, so the comprehensive plan has an urban growth area, and it's very small. And typically, I'm used to thinking in growth management where your comprehensive plan is 20-year growth vision. And frankly, there's no urban growth area that would allow us 2 years worth of growth, let alone 20. And there are a lot of people who are lining at my door who are of similar opinion, and that is we need to start talking now for growth beyond the next couple of years. And so-
I'm not saying I'm adverse to it, I'm just saying the comprehensive
Yes.
plan was
But yes.
recently adopted,
Yes.
and the city council said, we're not going to open this conversation, and now you're saying, well, we're going to open this conversation.
Yes, and, well, the old comprehensive plan specifically says our comprehensive plan amendment process, you apply in January, and we work through a certain timeline, and by the end of the year, we will make a decision. What happened was the Glenwood Street, or the Glenwood Avenue, Glenwood Street
Whatever.
comprehensive plan, it was the only one that came in 2017. And so it was being processed, and with Amanda leaving and Brad taking over, and it bled into January of this year before it got to the city council. And so their one opportunity to address comprehensive plan changes for 2018, that opportunity is gone because of the January meeting. So we're going to adjust the schedule so that they can apply in June or July. We'll take it to the Planning Commission in October, November, and by January of next year, the City Council will be able to use their silver bullet for 2019 if we choose to. So, yes, I'm aware that 2018, we don't have the opportunity. But what it specifically says is the council can only open the comprehensive plan once a year, and they chose not to this year. Our docket for 2018 is that magic bullet is gone. So I'm thinking in terms of 2019.
Okay, that makes sense. I understand.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah.
It used to be that the planning department, the planning director, did not accept an application for annexation without first taking it to council. And I don't know, I don't think that was codified, but that was always the procedure. And so so you didn't have an applicant like Glenwood pungle up a bunch of money and start the process without planning taking it to the council first before going to planning.
And that explains a lot, because there is a line item on the fee schedule which says a notice of intention to annex, or intention to amend is what it specifically says. And it's $250, and that would explain why there's $250 to get
Instead of
started.
$3,200.
And if you don't make the cut, you don't pay the rest of the fee. But if you do, you pay a larger fee, and it includes the planning commission and the rest of the service. That
So-
makes a lot of sense, but it's not codified, so I'm
But that's
guessing.
why. It was
Okay.
always the planner, you went in and talked to the planner and said, would the city council consider annexation? That was the Rob V method.
Yes. And at this point, I have a file with 4 emails of people saying they want to do it, and my response has been, I will call you later on this year. And so nobody's paid their $250 or their $2,000, so.
It'd be nice to go back to, in my opinion, it'd be nice to codify that.
Yes. I will add that to our list to talk about later on today.
I just have a couple general questions, and they're directed toward Travis.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Travis, do you have time for a question?
Yes, sorry. yes.
Okay, I thought we took marijuana. I noticed under page 13, it has, downtown, it has commercial, downtown revitalization, and then it has marijuana. I thought it was, we all took marijuana off the
Yes,
table,
you
so...
did, and I apologize, that should not.
Okay, so it shouldn't be there. Okay, and then in terms of residential code, I was very specific on multifamily, high-density residential, so I would really like to, I don't want to,
Yes, I rolled that all into, it's a general discussion that we need to talk about, changing the codes, reevaluating our residential zones, reevaluating our residential incentives and our tools. So that'll cover a lot of stuff. And that's why that's pushed out a little farther, because the first thing I need to do is find some time to drive around town and see what residential land hasn't been developed, and find out what has been developed and where our multifamily is, where our residential, and kind of do that windshield survey. I've been told that there was a housing survey that was done, and I haven't been able to find a copy.
I think it's dated.
Yeah. So I really need to go through that and kind of do that myself to make sure that
Okay.
it's to the level
But we
I
can
want.
prioritize when we get here and
Yes.
after we see the inventory and
Yes.
after we, okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
And that's going to go hand in hand with the argument that I'm going to need to make to you for expanding the urban growth area, industrial, commercial, residential, where's our current deficiency. And I can tell you, in the industrial land that's not currently developed, by looking at an aerial, but residential, I really have to do a drive-by.
Gun range isn't on here.
Sorry?
Gun range isn't on here.
I think we had agreed that we would throw that into the retooling our code. And I
okay.
actually had a conversation with Bill, and he said that he knew that was a conversation, but he was in no hurry to have that, because he's not necessarily wanting to push that right now. But it's funny, I just happened to be talking to Bill about that just last week. And so he knows it's on our list of stuff to do. And
I thought that came from the council.
That was from the mayor at the joint meeting.
yes, and I think, is it Bill Dunlap owns the property out on Horseshoe Lake? Yeah, and I think he told me he was the specific guy who was thinking about doing the range, and that's kind of why it came to a boil. So he's not necessarily, thinks it's a high priority for everything to our conversation. He knows there's a lot on our plate. I don't think he's going to push that right away, but it is on our list. And if it gets swept along with other things, we'll do it. But
Scott?
I think that was the topic, though, with the council. They decided that they probably didn't want to address it for residential, but they did want to address it for industrial and commercial, because a lot of work had been done. They figured rather than throw it out, they did want it in those two areas, and thought it might be a quick, easy way.
yeah. So it is on the list, but it's not one of the specifically called out high priorities.
And I do understand that.
Okay, is there anything more on the work plan?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. So the next thing is the handout for retooling our code, right?
So this is just a quick snapshot of the stuff that I've noticed. I've since probably doubled this list because I've been doing some research into some other projects. But it's just an example of if there's something that you want me to take a look at, you can simply just send me an email and I will add it to this list, and it's constantly getting longer. And what I will do is, like for next month, many of these as I can do, I will add a column that says the current language, and then I'll do cross out and put in the suggested language, and then you'll be able to read through that coming up to the meeting, and you might be able to go, okay, 1, 8, and 6, or 1, 8, and 16, those ones we like, they're good to go, but the other ones we want to have debate on. So we can kind of feel our way through that as we go.
Okay,
Okay,
so what are we doing next?
okay, so, I'm actually, sorry. So I also, if you don't have any particular questions about that, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, and it has to do with the packets that are at the back table, or that I had left for you out here.
So we're on to these now?
Yes.
Okay.
So the first thing I wanted to talk about, and that is, and this will make sense as I go through, traditionally the land use code, there's kind of three ways to think of codes. One is process-oriented. How do I treat a application when it comes in the door? I do this, then I move it here, then I send it to, then we do notice, then we hold the hearing, and then we sign the decision. That's all process-related stuff. And regardless of who applies or what you're applying for, we want that process to be exactly the same. They need to know, I'm going to do this, I'm going to send them a letter, we're going to send notice, we're going to have a hearing, and they will get a decision at the end of that process. Always going to be the same thing. The second thing, the second regulation that's applicable, and these are specific to uses. So this is an example of zoning. In the commercial zone, you allow commercial uses. And you allow dry cleaning and retail stores and drive-throughs and restaurants and bars and retail stores. Those are all uses to deal with the specific structure. So it's how we use the land or how we use a particular building on a piece of property. Now, the last thing that standards cover, and these are the physical standards of how that building works, how it looks, how it behaves, how we get services to it, where the connection points are. Those are all the physical parts of development, and how it's built, how it's sized, how it's located, how the physical functions are. So those are the three differences. Regardless of building or use, the process should always be the same. Regardless of the process or the physical standards, the use is determined by the zoning. So it may be a beautiful building, a beautiful AM/PM, but it's not a use that's compatible with the zoning. At the same time, the physical standard, what the building looks like and how big it can be, it's not determined by the zoning. It's not determined by what process you go through. It's determined by the physical standards. So I'll go through and try and explain that, or I'll fill that out and help give examples of that in a few minutes. So are there any questions about that? Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So the next, so let's talk about process first. Typically, there are 4 types of processes, and I think we covered this in the joint meeting, and that is a type 1, which is a administrative approval, and it requires no discretion involved. You either meet your setback or you don't. I can walk out there and measure, is this building going to be constructed 5 feet from the property line? Tape measure will tell me. I don't need to apply any professional judgment on that. That's a type 1 administrative decision. A type 2 administrative decision, it requires some limited discretion. So in other words, it requires public notice as well. That's a process-related issue. So for example, a home occupation that requires no outside storage. I have to drive by to determine, okay, are they storing roofing material in the yard, or is this just a roofer who happens to do his books in his den? So you would never notice that he's a roofer, a roofing business in his house, if he's got nothing stored outside. So it requires some limited discretion because I can tell whether he's storing materials there or not. Now, a type 3 is a quasi-judicial, and that's really where the Planning Commission and the hearings examiner, where you essentially sit as judges to evaluate some of the discretionary standards. Is it in the character of the neighborhood? You know, is it as a use that's compatible with the neighboring property? Have the impacts been mitigated? So those are the kind of quasi-judicial where you're acting as judges, applying your judgment to discretionary standards. And then a type 4 is a legislative decision. Those are policy, code changes, and adoptions to changes to maps and plans that have been adopted by ordinance. So those are really the domain of the legislative branch, which is the city council, excluding the mayor. So it's the council members. So those are kind of the typical 4 types of processes that exist. Now, oddly enough, City of Woodland, like Clark County, has a very clear process. City of Beaverton, where I worked, had very clear 4 types. They even use the same language in Oregon law and Washington law. Now, the City of Woodland has language that talks about type 1s and type 2s, but it doesn't define type 3s or 4s. So instead, what the City of Woodland does is, so this is the first of your handouts that is on your package. And you should recognize this because I handed it out at the joint meeting. And it kind of defines who's the decision maker. In this case, it says administrative conditional use permits are Public Works and staff makes the decision on those. The problem, of course, is there are 4 types of conditional use permits. And when somebody comes into the counter, I want to say, oh, you get a conditional use permit, that means you have to go to a public hearing. But I can't do that because some conditional uses I get to approve, and some conditional uses you get to approve, and some conditional use permits actually go to the hearings examiner. So I have to ask them a whole bunch of questions, then they have to apply before I can say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. You applied for the wrong kind of permit. I have to restart you on this different process because we actually have 4 options. That's kind of weird because our code doesn't clearly say, here's your lanes, pick one, and we'll run you through that process. To me, it's all about the process. Is it predictable? Can I reduce applicants' risk by helping them understand how many hoops they have to jump through before they apply rather than during and changing courses midstream? And another example is major variance and minor variances. They are not necessarily clearly defined, but whereas in Clark County, if you have a 10% variance, so in other words, if you have a 5-foot setback and you only have 4.5 feet, that's something that I could approve because it's pretty minimal. The average person wouldn't realize that there's 6 inches missing from that setback. A type 2 variance is between 10% and 25%. So now if it's 5 feet to 4 feet, or maybe 3.5 feet, the average person might notice that, and the zoning is noticeable, and the building code changes, so that requires public notice so your neighbor is aware that you're getting closer and closer to them. Whereas a type 3 is you have to build right on the property line because there's nowhere else. That requires planning commission or hearings examiner review because it's a substantial change that requires your discretion as to whether or not that makes sense. So that's kind of the difference between a clear process and ours that's kind of depends on who you talk to, and Amanda told you this and I'm telling you something different because I interpret it. You know, there's no clear numerical standard for me to apply. So that is the first page. Now, here's an example of how Clark County handles that, and that is they have a column, so rather than descriptors like we were talking about the minutes, how you describe what qualifies for a process, here it's very clear. If you have a short plat, you're applying for less than 4 lots, it is a type 2, and this is the standard that I'm going to apply to you. No ifs, ands, or buts. Anybody can do this research themselves and get an answer. Subdivisions are automatically type 3, and this is the standard, this is the process we're going to run you through. Now, in your handouts, there is a copy of this, an excerpt of this thing, and it demonstrates what I'm talking about. If you actually flip that over, this is the table of contents for their processes. And their type 1 process, there's essentially 5 sections that tell staff how to process that permit. When you go from a type 1 to a type 2, we add a few steps. We have a pre-application review, then we do a completeness review, then there's our procedures, then there's public notice, and then there's decision timelines, and then vesting and appeals. So the ones that are underlined are the added steps from the previous review or the steps that have changed. So when you go, so 1 and 2 are both administrative. A type 3 process is the quasi-judicial, and in that case, it's just like a type 2, only now we add the hearing and we add the burden of proof and the special appeal procedure. So it's getting more and more complex the higher up that hierarchy you get, which is reflected by non-discretionary, discretionary, super discretionary, hearings examiner, and then the type 4, it goes back to a short process because totally different standards. We're not talking about physical standards, we're talking about policy changes. So it's back to a very structured, abbreviated process. So that's why it's important for us to understand, or for us to understand why process is kind of an animal of its own. It has to deal with predictability, and procedurally we have to get the steps right because we don't want to get to the very end and then find out that they have to start over because they were in the wrong lane the whole time. So this will be an issue that we'll talk about as we go along. Okay. Any questions about the process stuff before I move on to use? Okay. So the second kind of regulations that we're going to be dealing with, and that is specifically uses. So this is an excerpt from the Clark County Code, and their code is actually pretty streamlined because I was there in, I think it was 2004. The county spent I think it was like $500,000 to get a consultant to come in and rewrite the entire code. Basically compartmentalize and organize it so it makes a lot of sense. So their individual zoning sections are all actually under a single title, and that's what your next handout is. This is the entire residential single-family district. And our single-family detached homes, they're permitted in each one of the zones. It's pretty clear. You look on the chart. What about duplexes? Well, they're prohibited in this zone and they're permitted in this zone. So it's very simple, especially like from a realtor's point of view. Somebody wants to build an apartment complex. You find it on this list. Well, what property should I be looking for? So that's kind of how this works. And then the key is over here on the right-hand side. If you're building multifamily, or let's say in this case you're building a family daycare center for seniors care, these are the zones you can build it in, and these are the standards that I'm going to apply to you. So there's no mystery, there's no interpretation, it's pretty clear and it's pretty readable. And you'll notice that process is not discussed here. It's compartmentalized, so residential uses are discussed in the residential zoning district. Okay? Now, if you look through that, you'll actually see I put boxes around Section A is the purpose of that zone. Section B is specific uses, and there's a Section C much farther along, and it's the development standards. So they compartmentalize within their code, which makes it a little more easier to maneuver in. Now, the Woodland Code is the white sheets that come next in your packet. And this is an example of our low-density zoning district. And it's a little more traditional of an older type of zoning code, but it's kind of all over the map. So you'll notice that there's a bunch of tabs in there. So let's start with the first page first. You'll see section 020. It's your principal uses. And then in the first sentence, it calls them permitted uses. So there's an inconsistency right there. Really what this should be is your permitted uses, your prohibited uses, and your conditional uses. So there's kind of a ambiguity right from the very beginning as to where to find it, because different codes call them, or different code sections call them different things. And so, for example, in 020A, adult family homes is a permitted principal use, whereas if you look at 030 in the second column, 030B is adult daycare home facilities, and those are accessory uses. So now I need to research what's the difference between the two, and then I need to figure out, okay, what does accessory mean versus principal? So that implies that there's complexity built into our code right there, because what appear to be the same thing mean different things depending on what section you're looking at. So if you go to the next page, kind of down to 1716.050, everything in front of that is uses, permitted, accessory, conditional uses, prohibited uses. So those are all use-related issues. Once you start going from section 060 down, these are special conditions that apply to the location of parking and single-family residential. So now we're talking physical development issues associated with the use. So we already can see that there's confusion and a blending of physical issues and use issues. We haven't even gotten into the process issues, so they're starting to get this confusion. And as you go down, there are these nice friendly boxes or tables, but if you look at the first table in that right column, it talks about lot sizes, and then you go to the second block and it modifies those block sizes, but it doesn't tell you what it means. You have to read that entire block several times to figure out what it says. And then you go to the third table and it also modifies lot sizes. So really the first should say sometimes the lot size, this first table, sometimes the lot size in the second table, and sometimes the lot size in the third table. Now we've got this repeating, how do I give somebody the quick answer at the front counter? It takes a lot of time to answer those questions. Whereas Clark County, it's like single family, multifamily, duplexes, permitted, permitted, permitted. And once you find the right zone, then we start dealing on zeroing in on an answer. So the last one on the bottom on the right-hand column talks about width, as does the first table on the next page on the top of the column. That's another width issue. And the setbacks, which seems like a logical table, it's not in a table, it's written sentences for the front, the side, the rear. And then there's lot coverage, which ironically there are 4 columns that all say the exact same thing. So if there should be one line that says lot coverage is 50% of the lot can be covered with structure. But instead, that takes 4 spaces, 4 lines instead of 1. So there's kind of this inconsistency within the formatting. Required parking spaces. Anybody who's read the code knows there's a whole section on parking spaces somewhere else in the code. So now we've got parking here and parking there, so depending on what part of the code, you're going to see different things. Now, I will point out that I put some tabs on the handouts that I gave you. If you take a look at those, like on page 386 of the code, that first tab represents the height standard for this zone. And then if you look on the right-hand column where the next tab is, well, this is the height standard for accessory structures. And then you advance a couple pages and you get to page 387. Section D talks about the height of structures when they're on the alley. And then you go a couple more pages and, there are 3 specific mentions of height depending on what you're looking at, whether it's an amateur radio, whether it's a building height exception, or whether it's fence height. So here's an example of how we have a use section that talks about residential development, and there's 5 or 6 physical qualifications mixed in there, and you literally have to read the entire section to make sure you don't miss anything. So this is an example of how our code is kind of a hybrid of process, use, and physical standard as one code. And that's what part of the reason why, the city gets this reputation of really confusing, really hard to work with, because it depends on what section I miss or gets missed or somebody picks up on at a later point. So that's kind of why the confusion occurs. So any questions about kind of our current code? Because I have one that's even worse. And so that's the green section here. It's the City of Beaverton code, and it's just a little more jumbled because they kind of do a hybrid of both of them. In this case, what you see is the land use zone for residential, and it's in the column across the top. So they have an R1 zone, R2 zone, R4, 5, 7, and 10. Now what they do is they put little postscripts or footnote marks on each one of those zones. So the R1, 2, 4, and 5, and 7 all are affected by footnote number 11. So I just happened to copy that and put it on here. And what it says is, so you go to the next page, footnote 11, a conditional use permit, planned unit development pursuant to this section, so we're talking about process, applies if the site is equal to or greater than 10 acres. So there's a process depending upon a physical standard, depending upon the use zone that you're dealing with. And so they have a table that is super confusing before you even get to the paragraphs of stuff that you have to wade through. So it's an example of how, if it's structured properly, you could theoretically do it, but it's kind of a great example of, so now we have that limitation in the R1 zone, and then if you look down on, so it talks about residential dwellings. If you look at C, which is detached homes, which basically is, you and I know that as one house, one lot. It's not attached to anything. It's got a footnote 12. And footnote 12 says that compact detached dwellings, so certain types of dwellings in that zone have further restrictions that apply depending on your lot size. So you can see how a poor structure very quickly becomes confusing and difficult. So I think what we're going to hopefully have conversations about is a simplification to tables and eliminate as much of the garble as possible and try and get to some simple standards in tables. And that's where we'll hopefully be going. Now, the other thing that Beaverton does that's actually very helpful in some cases is they use a table for the individual zones. So here's their setbacks. So in the R4 district, front is always 10, the rear is always 5, the side is always 5, and the garage is always 20. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts. The building height, the maximum building height is 35. So they have one section that includes all 6 of their residential zones. So that almost simplifies it in this case. It's super simple, because now instead of having 6 tables, we only have 1 table that covers all residential zones. So there are some cool things that can be taken out of different types of codes, and I'll try and put those formats and develop a format for you, and then you just decide what numbers you want to go in there. In certain zones, do you want, commercial zones, do you want bigger setbacks, smaller setbacks, bigger landscaping setbacks, smaller landscaping setbacks? So that's kind of where we'll be discussing when we start talking about the residential section. This is an example of how we'll be reviewing that. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay.
So we're talking about, restructuring a lot of the code in some ways, right?
Yes.
Is there any chance that the city council won't like that?
Yes, that's entirely.
If we do a lot of work on it and then they say, we don't like this format.
That's entirely possible. And the reason why I'm having this conversation with you is because there really are, I think, there are 2 tasks before us. Or 3 tasks before us. We need to figure out what format you like and whether or not it works to simplify it. That's why I'm advocating this. Let's try and develop a process, because we can streamline process. Regardless of what you're building, the process should be identified and streamlined to make it easy for applicants. The more difficult question is going to be use. What uses do you think should be allowed in what zones? And maybe we need to go from high and medium and low density. Maybe we need to introduce more zones or less zones. And that's a use question, because you want to create a hybrid, like a mixed use zone that allows people to put apartments above commercial, like we have in downtown, but we don't have anywhere else in the city. So maybe that's something you want to reintroduce as a physical standard, but the use isn't allowed anywhere in our code. So this is a new tool question about mobile home parks and RV parks and cottage housing and multi-use development. This is part of the residential puzzle that we're going to be talking about. Currently, none of those tools are allowed as a use. There's no process for them, and there's no physical standard for us to evaluate whether or not they're going to work. So, but ultimately, back to that question, and that is, once we've developed this framework, it's going to be so compelling that the city council is going to understand exactly what you're trying to do. Maybe we'll start with streamlining our processes and just take all the sections that apply to process and put it in one chapter, and that's the basis for the next discussion. Once we straighten out the processes and we know how to do, once I know how to do what I'm supposed to do, what standards I apply is the next conversation we can move to. And the use questions about what should be allowed in the zone, that's the kind of thing where we do open houses and we ask people, and each of you gets to host a table and a conversation with members of the community as to what they think. And then you guys get back together, and that's that small group exercise where, you get the input of others, and then you kind of synthesize that, and the 5 of you get 10 opinions each, and then by the time you get down to decide, there's 50 opinions just sitting at the dais having this discussion. So that's kind of the use and the planning process to talk about use. The physical standards is kind of a separate conversation. Whether you do it first or second or third, it doesn't matter, because ultimately it's a discussion about how big should our roads be and how much capacity should we build into pipes and how much window should there be in the commercial zone and how much brick should there be on houses. And maybe you decide that you don't get into that. There's some of that in our code, but it only applies in certain places. Maybe we want the downtown to maintain a certain historical look, and it requires more brick and less signage. Maybe the highway commercial district gets more signage and less design standards, but more landscaping. Or better looking buildings, more parking, less landscaping. Those are all the policy issues that you decide how you physically define how new development should look. So we'll break it down into individual conversations so that we're not talking about an individual piece of property and landscaping on that property. Let's have a general conversation about commercial zones. Should they have landscaping and more parking, less parking, more flex spaces? So we'll compartmentalize that. So that's going to be, this is going to be really relevant for the first thing we tackle, which will be the residential stuff, and start drawing this together. So that's it. That's kind of my presentation for how I expect our work plan for 2018 to fill out and what I hope to accomplish.
Hey, Travis.
Sure. Why not?
Could you come to the mic, please? I have a hard time hearing when I'm doing the minutes.
And name and address, formal thing.
Johanna Anderson. I work for Coldwell Banker Bain in Longview. The question is about the apartments. So the market demand for apartments from Vancouver to Battleground, Ambo, and there's none available in Ambo, I don't think, and to Woodland, there's a lack of supply for the demand. And so has this discussion already taken place, and did I miss it, about whether any apartments would be considered elsewhere than downtown Woodland?
I think that's sort of part of the inventory and residential
Yeah.
zoning process, so.
So
I
has
don't
it
think
already?
we've really had that discussion yet, but I think we're definitely planning to.
Okay.
I think that I think a couple of us council members during the rezone application identified about 600 units worth of available land in Woodland.
Okay, so it might happen.
Vacant land
Oh, okay. So the
that
possibility
was
exists.
properly zoned, multifamily or high
Okay.
density.
Well, this is what I like to hear. Thank you.
Okay.
Is there anything that you want me to do or address for next meeting, other than just start bringing language before you? Do you have do you have concerns about my game plan, or anything you want me to add?
Okay, so this page that said retooling the code, we're going to be working on, you're going
Yeah.
to bring us this next time, right?
Yes, and I will be adding to it, and some of that stuff is so small, you may not want to talk about it and just think
Yeah,
it's
I can
fine.
see, like, here, 2 lines are duplicate, delete 1, that's, easy.
Yeah, some of it's just simple house cleaning.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of meat to the retooling our code, which is why I think we can knock some of those off every month. We won't necessarily take them to city council, but, if I can do 10 of those the next month and you okay 8 of them, well, that's 8 in our pocket for when we do an ordinance that goes to the city council. 4 months from now, we might have 40 things on that list that are quick fixes when we start talking about cell towers with the city council. So we'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone as we're moving along.
Okay, and we're going to be talking about wireless next
Yeah,
time. so-
yeah.
So Travis, on the residential code, you talked about the inventory equation. Was there conversation about contracting with Nick Little to do an inventory for you?
No. So I haven't talked to anybody about potentially doing contracting. Anindita, the lady who did the downtown revitalization grant, has also mentioned that she'd be interested in doing some of that. But I'm not familiar enough with my budget at this point to know if there's any kind of grant or money available in my budget for consultants, stuff like that. So I will have that conversation with Pete, and, or it would be nice to get an intern who could help do some of that work. Public Works is going out for interns this summer, so I might be able to borrow one of their bodies for part of the time. So we'll see what kind of applications they get. So.
WSU Vancouver has student availability for that type of thing.
Yes. So I'm exploring that. That's why it's a month out, to give me a chance to figure out
How to do it.
How to approach that. So I also have submitted a call to the county assessor's office to see if they could send me a list, like an Excel spreadsheet of data from the assessment roll, because they theoretically have data on each individual property and a valuation code that says, is it valued at residential, is it valued at commercial, is it valued? So I can use some of that data to figure out, okay, well, there's no tax value on this property, that means it's vacant. And so if I can get a list from them that says, this parcel, this address, this size, this use code, I can group all of the empty properties together and get a very quick idea of, oh, well, there's 118 acres of vacant residential property. Then I just have to go through the GIS one by one and figure out, okay, where are those? Well, that's actually the airport, and that's this, and that's that. So yeah, it may be zoned residential, but it's not really viable. So hopefully the assessor's office will be able to provide me some of that data so that I can do a lot of that number crunching. And I may find out that I have enough information from them that I really don't need to do a lot of drive-by surveys, because I can narrow it down. And then I have to decide, okay, since I'm doing this statistical analysis, do I do just the residential, because that's what we want to talk about, or do I do residential, commercial, open space, critical areas, and all the rest of that while I'm doing it? So hopefully the assessor's office has data that I can get in Excel and do the quick analysis. But I mean, if they send it to me in PDF forms, I have to read every line to make sense of it. So hopefully I'll be able to find some shortcuts. And I also will be able to use Jody at Public Works, who's our GIS technician, and hopefully she'll be able to create maps of the data that I'm pulling. Between the two of us, we can produce both statistical analysis and spatial analysis and produce maps for you. So does that answer your question? Well, not necessarily about that person in particular, but if you know somebody, have them call me.
Well, it's just he's local,
Oh,
and he worked for the county,
oh,
so he has great access to it, and he's affordable. I think it's like $110, $120 an hour.
yeah, so I haven't explored that at this point. I'm just assuming that I'll be doing a lot of the work to figure out how big of a deal it's going to be. And given my timeline, I may have to farm it out to somebody.
So do we have any news of any new development, businesses coming in?
So we had 2 pre-application conferences today. We had Atlas Plumbing, and they are looking at building an addition to their existing business on the corner of Scott and Beacon. And also a gentleman who looks like he is going through the efforts of purchasing the Woodland Creek subdivision, which is north of the school, kind of the last piece of property at the northeast corner of Lewis River Road on the
North
west
of
side of...
the intermediate school?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was approved in 2006 for 137 lots, and the codes haven't really changed since then, so that approval expired. But he would like to submit basically the exact same information and have us expedite a review since nothing significant has changed, and potentially start doing some construction this summer. That's his goal. That may be a little aggressive or ambitious, but we'll see how it goes. So those are the two potential pre-applications that look like they could be projects on the horizon.
Isn't the density for that higher than that?
I don't know. It may very well be.
It seems like that application was a density blend with the property by the gas pipeline.
So they did have transferable rights that were attributed to that in 2006. Now whether,
And I think they lowered the density there for higher density on other projects.
oh really?
So I think there might be higher density available for that.
So I will have to go back and take a look at it.
There was some horse trading around critical areas there.
Yeah, I thought there were some challenges to, areas that were challenging in the property that,
Yes. So he may have to do some redesign, but at this point, he's going to contact his consultants and see how much has changed and do that evaluations. And so we may see that within a month or two, but he seemed optimistic that he could make it work. So that may be coming before you. It was approved in 2006, and it had 2 variances and a shoreline permit. And so we're trying to figure out what's going on with that.
Because it's by the creek?
It's close to the river.
Because it's close to the river, as close as it was to the river. But
There's also a creek through one corner.
Yes, yeah, and there are,
Across the other side of Lewis River Road.
yeah. I don't know why they required a shoreline permit in 2006, where that's one of the things I need to look into.
Because you're within 200 feet of the Lewis River.
What's that?
You're within 200 feet of the Lewis River, even though it's across the road.
At its closest point,
Yeah,
So
it
that
does
may-
seem silly,
that may be
because
what
the
it
city
is.
used to treat Lewis River Road as a barrier
Yeah.
and not treat it as shoreline, but it is.
And then we have a boundary line adjustment next to the hatchery, and we issued the court decision, we issued a couple other things that were on that list that I update every once in a while and send around to you.
yes, so basically, the yellow is things that have happened since the last month?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I've been doing that about every 2 weeks, trying to keep that updated, so.
Yes, the color coding is helpful, knowing that we don't have to, that it's what's changed.
And it's in alphabetical order, so if you know the name of the project, it's a little easier to find now, so.
Okay, are we ready to adjourn? Is there anything else? Second?
Oh, she's asking.
Anybody want a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Moved and seconded to adjourn, all in favor? Opposed? Okay, we're adjourned. I don't think I can second, can I?
I was surprised.
You are a member, you have all the rights.
Yeah.
Oh, did you? Who bought it?
Lester Rice.